She inherited a fortune, but her grandfather's came with a crushing public debt. Now, to save her legacy and herself, she must confront a truth far more complex than she ever imagined. Before starting the story, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Elara traced the peeling pain of the grand, decaying manor, the legal notice clutched in her hand feeling heavier than the crumbling bricks themselves. Sunlight, filtering weakly through grime-streaked panes, did little to dispel the oppressive gloom that clung to every shadow corner. The air hung thick with the scent of dust, damp wood, and something vaguely metallic, the lingering, unidentifiable aroma of a life abruptly extinguished. Her estranged grandfather, Elias Thorne, a man she met only a handful of times and remembered mostly as a stern, unsmiling presence, was dead, and in death, he'd managed to burden her more profoundly than he ever had in life. The will, delivered with a smug solemnity by Mr. Abernathy, Elias's perpetually nervous solicitor, had been shockingly concise. Elara inherited the Thorne estate, a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity perched on the outskirts of Havenwood, its skeletal trees clawing at the perpetually overcast sky. But the inheritance was no gift. It came with a devastating caveat. She must personally repay all of his substantial, undisclosed debts within 6 months. Failure meant swift and ruthless liquidation of everything, from the moth-eaten tapestries to the very land beneath her feet. And most galling of all, her own modest savings, the meager sum she'd painstakingly squirreled away over years of teaching art classes and selling small canvases, had been inexplicably absorbed into his accounts, now part of the looming financial black hole. Elara gripped the legal paper tighter, the sharp edge digging into her palm. She'd always prided herself on her independence, her quiet rebellion against the very idea of a family legacy. Her life in the bustling city, surrounded by vibrant colors and the hum of creativity, had been a conscious rejection of the stifling provincialism she associated with the Thorne name. Now, that forgotten past had reached out, a cold, bony hand dragging her back to a place she never wanted to see again. Havenwood, a town Elias Thorne had seemingly terrorized with his ruthless business practices, watched her arrival with a mixture of morbid curiosity and thinly veiled glee. She could feel their eyes on her, a collective, silent judgment that followed her from the moment her beat-up car sputtered down Main Street. The local bakery owner, Mrs. Gable, usually so effusive, had offered a strange smile and a pie on the house that felt less like a kindness and more like an offering to a sacrificial lamb. Mr. Henderson, who ran the hardware store Elias had reputedly tried to put out of business years ago, merely grunted when she asked for directions to the estate, his gaze lingering with a distinct lack of sympathy. Everywhere she turned, the whispers followed her, a low hum of schadenfreude that permeated the very air of Havenwood. The old man's just dragging her down with him. Serves him right, but poor girl. She'll never pay it off, not in a million years. The general consensus was clear. The Thorne estate was doomed, and so, by extension, was she. Elias Thorne, even in death, was proving himself to be a master of misery, casting a long, dark shadow that now threatened to engulf his unsuspecting granddaughter. Her initial, visceral instinct was to flee, to cut ties with the Thorne name and its cursed legacy once and for all, to pack her bags, abandon the crumbling manor, and return to the anonymity of her city life, even if it meant starting completely over, penniless. What moral obligation did she truly have to a man who had been little more than a phantom in her life, a man whose memory was universally reviled, even by her own distant relatives who had long since severed ties with the Thorne line? But a stubborn pride, a faint, almost imperceptible echo of the family honor she barely understood, held her fast. It wasn't a sense of loyalty to Elias. Certainly not. It was something more primal, a deep-seated aversion to being defeated, to being seen as a failure by a town that already expected her to buckle. She wouldn't let Elias, even from the grave, destroy her or confirm Havenwood's worst suspicions. There was a quiet defiance within her, a simmering anger at being forced into this impossible position. She would try. She would, at the very least, understand the full extent of this inherited burden before she succumbed to it. The solicitor's final words echoed in her mind. 6 months, Ms. Thorne. Not a day more. 6 months to unravel a lifetime of a reclusive, ruthless man's financial secrets. 6 months to save an estate she didn't want, from debt she hadn't incurred, for a legacy she despised. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating. As dust painted the sky in bruised purples and grays, the old manor seemed to sigh around her, a tired, ancient beast settling in for another long, lonely night. Elara knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning of her ordeal. The true nature of Elias Thorne, and perhaps her own, was yet to be revealed. The morning after her desolate arrival, Elara found herself drawn, almost against her will, into the heart of Havenwood. The town square, quaint and deceptively charming with its cobblestones and blooming petunias, felt less like a welcoming hub and more like a public forum for her misfortune. Every glance, every hushed conversation that abruptly ceased as she passed, prickled at her skin. The air, usually crisp with the scent of pine and distant baking bread, now seemed thick with unspoken judgments and the palpable weight of local history. She tried to be inconspicuous, blending into the small stream of early risers heading toward the bakery, but it was useless. Her city clothes, though practical, stood out against the town's subdued palette, and the very act of walking through Havenwood as a Thorne felt like wearing a scarlet letter. She heard it in snippets, like fragments of broken glass. The old man's just dragging her down with him. Serve him right, but poor girl. She'll never pay it off, not in a million years. Each whisper, a tiny barb, found its mark. Her first real encounter came at the Daily Grind, Havenwood's only coffee shop. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose perpetually flour-dusted apron suggested a life devoted to dough, managed the counter. She was usually a whirlwind of effusive greetings and unsolicited advice. But today, her smile was strained, her eyes darting away every time Elara met her gaze. "Morning, dear," she chirped, the cheerfulness sounding brittle. "Just for you, a fresh slice of apple pie. On the house." The gesture, meant as kindness, felt less like a comfort and more like an offering to a sacrificial lamb already on the altar. It solidified Elara's sense of being an object of pity, a living, breathing testament to Elias Thorne's lasting blight on the town. Later, she ventured into Henderson's hardware, a cluttered cavern smelling of sawdust and oil. Mr. Henderson, a man with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, was notoriously taciturn. When Elara, mustering what little politeness she had left, asked for directions to a specific section of the dilapidated Thorne estate's fence line, his response was a curt grunt. His gaze, however, lingered not with malice, but with a distinct, unsettling lack of sympathy that spoke volumes. His family business, a generational staple in Havenwood, had reportedly almost been driven to bankruptcy by one of Elias Thorne's more aggressive maneuvers decades ago. The memory, clearly, still festered. The cumulative effect of these interactions was a dull ache of resentment in Elara's chest. Why was she here? What moral obligation did she truly have to a man who had been little more than a phantom in her life, a distant, severe figure whose memory was universally reviled, even by her own distant relatives who had long since severed ties with the Thorne line? Her own father, Elias's only son, had moved halfway across the country the moment he could, consciously building a life free of the Thorne shadow, a decision Elara now understood with searing clarity. She found herself walking toward the town hall, a solid brick building with a faded historical marker. Inside, she sought out Mayor Thompson, a man whose family had once owned a thriving timber mill until Elias Thorne's conglomerate had swooped in, leaving a trail of layoffs and shuttered operations. Mayor Thompson, a man with a perpetually weary sigh etched onto his face, offered a perfunctory condolence, his eyes scanning Elara's face with an unsettling mix of weariness and what almost seemed like triumph. He swiftly moved on to the topic of the estate's impending demise. "It's a shame, of course," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "But frankly, Miss Thorne, the community has long anticipated this. The Thorne property. It's been a blight, a reminder of a darker time for Havenwood. Its liquidation, unfortunate as it is for you personally, will allow us to finally move forward. There's talk of a new community park, perhaps even affordable housing." His words, though cloaked in polite civic duty, were a thinly veiled declaration of victory. They weren't just anticipating the estate's collapse. They were hoping for it, cheering it on. The conversation solidified Elara's initial, visceral instinct to flee, to pack her bags, abandon the crumbling manor, and return to the anonymity of her city life, even if it meant starting completely over, penniless. She could invent a new past. She had the Thorne name like an ill-fitting skin. What was the point of fighting for a legacy that no one, not even she, truly wanted? But a stubborn pride, a faint, almost imperceptible echo of the family honor she barely understood, held her fast. It wasn't a sense of loyalty to Elias. Certainly not. It was something more primal, a deep-seated aversion to being defeated, to being seen as a failure by a town that already expected her to buckle. She pictured their faces, the subtle smirks and pitying glances, and a slow burn ignited within her. No, she wouldn't let Elias, even from the grave, destroy her or confirm Havenwood's worst suspicions. There was a quiet defiance within her, a simmering anger being forced into this impossible position. She would try. She would, at the very least, understand the full extent of this inherited burden before she succumbed to it. She would open every ledger, trace every transaction, and demand answers from Mr. Abernathy, the solicitor who seemed to know more than he was letting on. She wouldn't simply walk away. Not yet. Not while the collective gaze of Havenwood was so intently fixed upon her, waiting for her to stumble. The quiet defiance hardened into grim determination. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She would face this impossible task, not for Elias Thorne, but for herself, for the stubborn, independent spirit that refused to be broken. The manor was a labyrinth of shadows and dust, each room a silent, decaying testament to a life lived in isolation. Elara had always imagined inherited wealth to be grand, perhaps a little opulent, but never this oppressive. The Thorne estate wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum of forgotten things, a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity where silence echoed and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a sigh. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows like tiny, indifferent spirits inhabiting a forgotten realm. But it was a study that truly overwhelmed her. A cavernous room, dominated by a massive, mahogany desk that looked as though it could weather a hurricane. It was the epicenter of Elias Thorne's existence. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes on economics, law, and obscure industrial histories. Every surface was buried under a chaotic eruption of paper. Files upon files, boxes overflowing with ledgers, invoices, cryptic handwritten notes, and what appeared to be decades of correspondence. The sheer volume was an avalanche, a paper tsunami that threatened to bury her alive. Elara's initial foray into this financial wilderness was met with a dizzying sense of futility. She started with the most recent stacks, hoping to find some logical order, some system that would make sense of chaos. There was none. Elias Thorne, it seemed, had been a hoarder of information, but a chaotic organizer. Invoices for raw materials lay next to centuries-old land deeds. Bank statements were tucked into envelopes containing what looked like ancient family recipes. Each document seemed to deliberately obscure another, a perverse game of hide-and-seek. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of sifting, sorting, and squinting at faded ink. Her finger became perpetually smudged with dust, her eyes strained from deciphering Elias's crabbed handwriting. The numbers were staggering, far more than she'd ever imagined. Loans, interest payments, promissory notes. The terminology alone was a foreign language. She tried to categorize them by creditor, by date, by type of transaction, but the sheer scale of his alleged indebtedness was mind-boggling. It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. The creditors were relentless, their patience worn thin by years of dealing with Elias Thorne's reclusive nature, and now, his sudden death. Their calls and letters piled up on the once pristine surfaces of the desk, each one a fresh reminder of the impossible task before her. Lawyers from various firms, debt collectors with voices like sandpaper, representatives from banks she'd never even heard of, they all wanted their money, and they wanted it yesterday. They spoke in cold, legalistic terms about liens, foreclosures, and asset seizure. Each call was a fresh blow, each letter a new weight pressing down on her shoulders. "Miss Thorne, we understand this is a difficult time." One particularly unctuous voice purred over the phone. But the outstanding balance on the Thorne Consolidated Industries loan is now $2,700,000, with interest accruing daily. We require a payment plan within the week, or we will be forced to initiate legal proceedings. Elara would scribble notes, her hands shaking, trying to connect the dots between the figures on the phone and the reams of paper before her. It was like piecing together a vast, fragmented puzzle without knowing what the final picture was supposed to be. The complexity of Elias's financial entanglements was beyond anything she, an artist with modest income and simple spreadsheets, could comprehend. His empire, whatever it truly was built on a foundation of opaque transactions and convoluted agreements. Doubt gnawed at her resolve, an insidious worm burrowing into the last vestiges of her determination. The whispers from Havenwood echoed in her mind. She'll never pay it off. It's a losing battle. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she should just walk away. Let the lawyers liquidate the estate. Let the creditors pick over the bones. What difference would it make? She had no emotional attachment to this house, this name, this legacy of cold numbers and colder resentment. One evening, utterly drained, she found herself staring out of the study window at the encroaching twilight. The gnarled trees outside seemed to mock her, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the darkening sky. The silence of the manor, once merely oppressive, now felt like a vast, knowing presence, observing her struggle with an ancient, indifferent wisdom. She was alone in this enormous, decaying monument to a man she barely knew, fighting a battle she hadn't chosen. A fleeting thought crossed her mind. Maybe Elias wanted her to fail. Maybe this was his final, cruel joke from beyond the grave, a twisted form of revenge on a granddaughter who had dared to live her own life, far from his shadow. The idea was chilling, but it made a perverse kind of sense given his reputation. He was a man who had built his empire on the ruination of others. Why would his last act be any different? She slumped back into Elias's enormous leather chair, the worn leather creaking softly under her weight. The desk before her, once a symbol of power, now felt like a mountain of impossibility. The legal notice lay half-buried under a pile of antiquated bond certificates. 6 months. She was already 2 months in, and felt no closer to understanding, let alone resolving anything. The hope that had flickered in Chapter 1 was rapidly dimming, replaced by a profound, soul-wearying exhaustion. The moral dilemma of her initial decision to stay felt less like a noble test and more like a cruel trap. The estate wasn't just crumbling. It was actively consuming her. Amidst the mind-numbing stacks of financial documents, Elara began to unearth another, more sinister layer of Elias Thorne's existence. Tucked between ledgers filled with cryptic numerical entries and invoices for massive industrial machinery, she found fragmented newspaper clippings. Yellowed and brittle with age, their headlines screamed stories of a different kind of profit, one built on the misery of others. Each article painted a chilling portrait of a man utterly devoid of scruples, a financial predator who stalked Havenwood's economic landscape. One clipping detailed a forced land acquisition, a sprawling orchard owned by the Miller family for generations, suddenly swallowed by Elias's burgeoning conglomerate under questionable legal pretenses. The Millers, a proud and hard-working family, had vanished from Havenwood shortly thereafter, their livelihood and legacy extinguished. Another article chronicled a hostile takeover of a small, beloved local dairy farm, the Havenwood Creamery, which had been a community staple for over 50 years. The owner, a jovial man named Old Man Fitzwilliam, was quoted, his voice raw with despair, speaking of underhanded tactics and threats he couldn't fight. The creamery had been dismantled, its land sold off for commercial development. Elara read about small businesses, cornerstones of Havenwood's economy and identity, systematically driven into bankruptcy by Elias Thorne. The independent bookstore, the quaint general store, the family-run lumber yard. One by one, they had withered and died in the face of Elias's relentless expansion. His methods were always described with chilling precision, buying up competitors' debts, exploiting obscure legal loopholes, or simply outmaneuvering them with a cold, calculated ruthlessness that left no room for sentiment. The more she read, the more the whispers from the town, once vague and accusatory, crystallized into horrifyingly concrete truths. The bitterness of Mrs. Gable's strained smile, the palpable resentment from Mr. Henderson, the weary triumph in Mayor Thompson's eyes. It all made horrifying sense now. Elias Thorne hadn't just amassed a fortune. He had built on the shattered dreams and ruined lives of the very people who had watched her arrival with such thinly veiled disdain. He was not merely a shrewd businessman. He was a monster, a parasite who had thrived on the misfortunes of others, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. The inherited pride that had initially fueled her determination now curdled into a profound shame. How could she possibly be fighting to save the legacy of such a man? What moral obligation did she truly have to preserve the memory of someone so universally despised, someone who brought so much suffering to this quiet, unassuming town? The very bricks of the manor, once merely imposing, now seemed to vibrate with the echoes of injustice. Every faded photograph of Elias, every piece of his heavy, ornate furniture, felt tainted. She remembered an old black-and-white photograph she found in a dusty album. Elias, stern and unsmiling, standing beside her father as a small boy. Her father, even then, had seemed to shrink from his formidable presence. It was no wonder he had fled Havenwood the moment he could, consciously severing ties with the Thorne name, determined to build a life free of its shadow. Elara had always admired his independence, his quiet rejection of his heritage. Now, she understood the depth of his conviction. He hadn't just rejected a family. He had escaped a curse. The thought of continuing to sift through this mountain of evidence, this archive of cruelty, became unbearable. Each newspaper clipping, each legal document detailing another act of calculated aggression, chipped away at her resolve. Her initial spark of defiance, her stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstances, flickered weakly against the overwhelming tide of disgust. What was the point? To pay off debts incurred by a man who had systematically exploited countless others? To preserve a decaying manor that symbolized everything corrupt and avaricious? The idea felt not just futile, but morally repugnant. Her artistic sensibilities, always attuned to beauty and harmony, recoiled from the ugliness of Elias Thorne's life. She was an artist. Her purpose was to create, to bring color and light into the world, not to become entangled in the dark, dusty aftermath of a financial war. She imagined herself walking away, simply abandoning the estate. Let the banks and the creditors have it. Let Havenwood celebrate its demolition, finally erasing the last physical vestige of Elias Thorne's oppressive reign. It would be a messy public failure, yes, but it would be her choice. A liberation, even if it came with the sting of personal financial ruin and the silent judgment of the town. Better be poor and free, she reasoned, than bound to the ghost of a monster. The moral test she believed she was facing, the dilemma of whether personal liberation was worth abandoning a family obligation, now felt laughably trivial. The real question, she realized, was far more profound. Could she, in good conscience, continue to honor a legacy built on such callous disregard for human well-being? The answer, chillingly, was a resounding no. The more she read, the more firmly she believed that walking away wasn't abandonment. It was an act of moral clarity. She closed the last article, her hand trembling. The weight of absence was nothing compared to the suffocating burden of a truly monstrous presence. She was done. She would tell Mr. Abernathy first thing in the morning. Weeks blurred into months, each day a slow, suffocating descent into the depths of Elias Thorne's ruinous legacy. Elara felt herself shrinking, her vibrant artist spirit dulled by the relentless onslaught of debt notices and the oppressive weight of her grandfather's documented cruelties. The initial anger had drained away, replaced by a profound weariness. She was exhausted, demoralized, and utterly defeated. The manor, once merely imposing, now felt like a cage. She was down her last few weeks before the 6-month deadline loomed. The lawyers had sent increasingly terse communications. The creditors' calls had grown sharper, their patience officially worn thin. There was no more fight left in her. She had tried. She had sifted through mountains of paper, faced the town's silent condemnation, and confronted the horrifying truth of Elias Thorne's ruthless past. And it was enough. More than enough. She was clearing out Elias's massive, imposing desk, preparing to make the call to Mr. Abernathy, the solicitor. The words were already rehearsed in her head. Proceed with the liquidation. I can't do it. I'm done. It would be a messy public failure, a confirmation of Havenwood's worst predictions, but it would also be a liberation. The thought of finally walking away, leaving the dust and the ghosts and the crushing weight of the Thorne name behind, was a seductive one. The desk itself was a monument to Elias's formidable presence, crafted from dark, heavy wood, scarred with the marks of countless transactions. She ran her hand over its smooth, cool surface, a gesture of finality. As she reached into the deepest drawer to pull out a forgotten stack of ancient blueprints, her fingers brushed against something unusual. It wasn't the rough, unfinished wood of the drawer's interior. It was smooth, almost polished. Curiosity, a faint flicker in the dying embers of her hope, compelled her to investigate. She pulled the drawer completely out, setting it carefully on the dusty floor. Lying flat against the underside of the desk's top, hidden by the frame of the drawer, was a thin, loose panel. It blended so seamlessly with the surrounding wood that it would have been impossible to detect without precisely the angle and pressure of her searching hand. A strange jolt went through her. This wasn't just a loose piece. It felt deliberate. Elias Thorne, for all his meticulous financial records, had never struck her as a man given to hidden compartments. He was too direct, too brutal in his efficiency. Yet, here it was. With a cautious prod, the panel slid almost silently inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Her heart gave an unexpected thump. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something smooth and leathery. She pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, distinct from all the others she had tirelessly catalogued. This one was old, its cover worn smooth by countless touches, its pages brittle with age. Unlike the meticulously labeled volumes that filled the shelves, this one bore no markings, no title, no indication of its contents. It felt lighter, yet somehow more significant, than any other document she had touched in the entire manor. She carried it over to the window, the waning afternoon light casting a pale glow on its unassuming cover. The leather felt strangely warm beneath her fingertips. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent of old paper and something else, something like dried lavender or faint pipe tobacco. It was unlike anything else in Elias's austere study. A tremor of anticipation ran through her. After weeks of despair, of sifting through the grime of financial ruin and moral depravity, this small, hidden object felt like an anomaly, a rogue element in a universe she had come to understand as uniformly bleak. What could be so important, so secret, that Elias Thorne, a man who left no stone unturned in his ruthless pursuit of wealth, would hide it away so carefully? She thought of the newspaper clippings, the tales of his merciless land grabs and company dissolutions. Was this a record of even darker deeds? A confessional, perhaps, of some ultimate, unspeakable crime? The thought sent a chill down her spine, but oddly, it also sparked a perverse kind of fascination. After everything she'd uncovered, what more horrors could he possibly reveal? With trembling fingers, Elara opened the ledger. The first page was blank, pristine, and unblemished. She turned to the next, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes scanned the meticulous, familiar script. Elias's handwriting, unmistakable in its precision. But the entries weren't financial transactions in the conventional sense. They weren't debts or assets or legal agreements. They were something else entirely, something utterly unexpected. And in that moment, the oppressive silence of the manor felt charged, suddenly holding its breath. With trembling fingers, Elara opened the small, leather-bound ledger. Her initial fear of uncovering some darker, even more damning secret quickly dissipated, replaced by a profound confusion. The first page was blank, pristine, and unblemished, an innocent introduction to what felt increasingly like an anomaly in Elias Thorne's otherwise sordid narrative. She turned to the next. Her breath hitched. Elias's handwriting, precise and unyielding, filled the page, but the entries weren't what she expected. They weren't financial transactions in the conventional sense. There were dates, meticulously noted, spanning decades. Beside them were small sums of money, surprisingly modest compared to colossal debts she'd been wrestling with. And then there were names, not names of businesses or investment firms, or even her grandfather's vast network of creditors. These were names of local families, individuals she vaguely recognized from Havenwood, or remembered hearing about from the older residents. Some were familiar, like the Millers, the family whose orchard Elias had supposedly ruined. Others were less distinct. Old Man Fitzwilliam of the Creamery. Then there were broader categories: orphanage, roof repair, scholarship fund, anonymous, medical supplies, disaster relief. Each entry was followed by the cryptic annotation: paid via proxy. A cold, disbelieving shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't a ledger of debts or profits. This was something entirely different. It was a record of giving, not taking. The small sums of personal names, the community-focused descriptions. It contradicted every single piece of evidence she had painstakingly unearthed about Elias Thorne. It defied every whisper she'd heard in town, every accusatory newspaper clipping. She flipped through the pages, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. More names, more dates, more seemingly random acts of generosity. There was an entry from 10 years ago. Havenwood Children's Hospital Wing, electrical upgrade, anonymous donation. Another more recent, Mrs. Clara Jenkins, medical bills, emergency fund. Clara Jenkins was the elderly woman who lived 2 streets over from a manor, known for her struggles after a severe illness. How could Elias, the ruthless magnate, have anything to do with her? Elara frantically began to cross-reference the names and events in the hidden ledger with the very same newspaper clippings she had previously used to condemn him. The results were startling, almost impossible to comprehend. The entry for the orphanage roof repair coincided precisely with a major storm that had devastated Havenwood years ago. She remembered the headlines, the pleas for help for the badly damaged orphanage, and then, inexplicably, the news that anonymous funds had appeared, allowing the building to be rebuilt quickly and without public fundraising. Elias Thorne's name had never been mentioned. In fact, during that period, the newspapers had been focused on one of his particularly aggressive business maneuvers, diverting attention completely. The scholarship fund, anonymous, matched stories she'd heard from the town's older residents. Whispers of local students from disadvantaged backgrounds suddenly attending prestigious universities on unknown benefactors' dimes. There had been no public donor, no grand ceremony, just a quiet, life-changing opportunity. And according to Elias's dates in the ledger, these scholarships had been granted during periods when he was publicly entangled in some of his most controversial business dealings, drawing all scrutiny onto his alleged ruthlessness. Her eyes fell on an entry related to the Millers. The ledger noted a substantial sum marked Miller family, relocation assistance, new farm purchase. This was the family whose orchard Elias had supposedly ruined. But this entry suggested he hadn't just taken their land. He had seemingly provided them with the means to start anew, elsewhere. And the timing? It coincided with the very period the newspapers had decried his forced acquisition of their land. He had played the villain in public, while seemingly providing a lifeline in secret. The hostile takeover of Old Man Fitzwilliam's Havenwood Creamery suddenly took on a new light. The ledger recorded substantial payments to Fitzwilliam Pension Fund, post-closure support. It was dated shortly after the creamery closed, a period when the town was mourning its loss. The payments continued for years, meticulously recorded. Elias hadn't just shut it down. He had seemingly ensured Old Man Fitzwilliam and his employees were cared for, all while publicly taking the blame for the closure. The complexity of it all made her head spin. Elias Thorne's ruthless acquisition of a specific plot of land, denounced at the time as another example of his insatiable greed, was marked in the hidden ledger as land donation, community clinic project. The new community clinic, which Havenwood residents had celebrated as a triumph of local initiative, had appeared mysteriously on land that had simply been donated by an anonymous party. He had been using his ruthless business dealings not to amass personal wealth for himself, but as a calculated cover. His aggressive tactics, his public image as a heartless titan, had served as a smokescreen. He acquired the necessary funds through methods that would ensure he drew no suspicion as a philanthropist, directing all attention to his perceived villainy. The vast sums he appeared to be accumulating through his harsh dealings were, in fact, being funneled meticulously and anonymously back into the community he seemed intent on destroying. The debts she had been frantically trying to pay off, the ones that threatened to liquidate the estate and her own savings, were, she now realized, the precise amounts he had kept liquid to fund these ongoing secret donations. They weren't debts in the traditional sense, but rather a final ultimate fund, a last act of philanthropy disguised as financial ruin. A profound shift began within her. The shame she'd carried for her grandfather evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of understanding and a deep, aching respect. Elias hadn't burdened her with debt. He had given her a test of whether she would simply accept the surface-level narrative, the public condemnation, or whether she would dig deeper, push past the obvious, and find the hidden truth. He wasn't a villain. He was a tragic, complex figure, sacrificing his own reputation, willingly bearing the weight of their scorn, so that his good deeds would remain untainted by his controversial name. The quiet, almost sacred act of his hidden generosity, conducted under the cloak of cruelty, revealed a man far more nuanced and selfless than anyone, including Elara, had ever imagined. The cold, logical Elias Thorne had been protecting his community, not exploiting it. And in that moment, the entire manor seemed to shed its dust and shadows, bathed in a new, unexpected light. Elara's hands trembled, not from fatigue anymore, but from the sheer force of revelation that was shattering her entire perception of Elias Thorne. The small, unassuming ledger felt like a sacred text, each entry a whisper from a man who had chosen to be reviled rather than revealed. She didn't just read the names and dates. She felt them, a visceral connection to the stories of Havenwood she dismissed as simple folklore or the bitter ramblings of the wronged. She needed more than just a ledger. She needed confirmation, irrefutable proof that this wasn't some elaborate, posthumous joke. She returned to the chaotic study, her eyes now seeing the mountains of paper through a completely new lens. What she had dismissed as disorganization, she now suspected was a deliberate obfuscation. She started frantically pulling out newspaper clippings, articles she had previously skimmed with disgust, now rereading them with a desperate, burgeoning hope. The orphanage roof repair entry in the hidden ledger was dated October 12, 1998. Elara located a faded Havenwood chronicle from that precise week. The headline blared, "Havenwood Orphanage devastated by October storm. Funds desperately needed." A few weeks later, another article, "Orphanage rebuilding efforts underway. Anonymous donor steps forward." No name, no fanfare. Just a quiet announcement that the impossible had happened. And during that very period, Elias Thorne had been embroiled in a highly publicized, ruthless hostile takeover of a local lumber mill, diverting all public attention and condemnation squarely onto himself. It was a perfect diabolical smokescreen. Next, she sought out the articles detailing the Miller family's tragedy. The ledger stated, "Miller family, relocation assistance, new farm purchase, $120,000. The local newspaper archives confirmed Elias Thorne's aggressive acquisition of their orchard in the spring of 2005. But digging deeper, Elara found a small, almost unnoticeable classified ad from a neighboring county newspaper a few months later. Dairy farm for sale. Owner relocating due to unexpected circumstances. Quick sale preferred. The property listed matched the description of the new farm mentioned in a hushed conversation she'd overheard at the bakery. A piece of gossip about the Millers having suddenly moved away, but landed on their feet somehow. Elias hadn't just taken their land. He had used his reputation as a ruthless acquirer to force a sale, then secretly ensured they had the means to start anew, protecting them from public pity, while simultaneously taking the full brunt of the town's anger. The story of Old Man Fitzwilliam's Havenwood Creamery was another stark example. The hidden ledger recorded meticulous monthly payments for years under Fitzwilliam Pension Fund, post-closure support. She pulled out the yellowed headline, "Havenwood Creamery closes. Local icon crushed by Thorne Industries." The town had openly mourned, their outrage directed squarely at Elias. Yet, tucked away in the back of the ledger were these consistent, quiet contributions that lasted until Fitzwilliam's passing. Elias had, in essence, provided a lifetime pension for the man he was publicly accused of ruining. As she connected more dots, a pattern emerged, chillingly consistent and profoundly heartbreaking. Elias Thorne had been deliberately cultivating his image as a villain. His ruthless acquisition of a specific plot of land, condemned as another example of his insatiable greed, was marked in the hidden ledger as Land Donation, Community Clinic Project. Havenwood had celebrated the new community clinic as a triumph of local initiative, built on land anonymously donated. The very same land that Elias had publicly stolen from an elderly couple just months prior, drawing all their scorn. He was a master of misdirection. He funneled profits from his most aggressive ventures, the very ones that cemented his reputation as a heartless titan, directly into these secret acts of charity, the large debts she had been frantically trying to pay off, the ones that threatened to liquidate the estate and her own savings, were, she now realized, the precise amounts he had kept liquid to fund these ongoing secret donations. They weren't debts in the traditional sense, but rather a final, ultimate fund, a carefully calculated reserve for his quiet philanthropy, disguised as financial ruin. It was a final test, a last act of protection, ensuring his generosity continued even after his death, untouched by his tarnished name. The sheer scale of his self-sacrifice was breathtaking. He had chosen to be hated, to live a life devoid of public affection or recognition, all to protect his acts of kindness from being tainted by his controversial persona. Every scornful glance, every bitter whisper in Havenwood, had been a consequence he had willingly embraced. He had built an empire of giving, concealed beneath a fortress of villainy. Elara felt a profound shift within her. The shame she carried for her grandfather evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of understanding and a deep, aching respect. Elias hadn't burdened her with debt. He had given her a test of whether she would simply accept the surface-level narrative, the public condemnation, or dig deeper, push past the obvious, and find the hidden truth. He wasn't a villain. He was a tragic, complex figure, sacrificing his own reputation, willingly bearing the weight of their scorn, so that his good deeds will remain untainted by his controversial name. The quiet, almost sacred act of his hidden generosity, conducted under the cloak of cruelty, revealed a man far more nuanced and selfless than anyone, including Elara, had ever imagined. The cold, logical Elias Thorne had been protecting his community, not exploiting it. And in that moment, the entire manor seemed to shed its dust and shadows, bathed in a new, unexpected light. The heavy air lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose that resonated deep within her, echoing the quiet strength of the man who had truly built this legacy. The truth, once a fragmented mosaic of whispers and accusations, now coalesced into a complete, horrifying, yet undeniably beautiful picture. Elias Thorne hadn't just been accumulating wealth for himself. He had been meticulously, almost obsessively, funneling his profits, earned through methods he knew would make him despised, into a vast, anonymous network of charity. The debts that had driven Elara to the brink of despair were, in fact, the precise amounts he had kept liquid, accessible only through this final, arduous test, to fund these ongoing secret donations. Elara sat amidst the sprawling chaos of the study, the hidden ledger clutched to her chest, its worn leather cover a stark contrast to the slick, impersonal financial documents surrounding her. Her mind replayed every scornful glance from the Havenwood townsfolk, every bitter newspaper headline, every cutting remark about Elias's supposed heartlessness. Now, each memory was recontextualized, imbued with a devastating irony. He hadn't been oblivious to their hatred. He had cultivated it. He had chosen to be hated, to bear the weight of their scorn, so that his good deeds will remain untainted by his controversial name. She remembered the story of the old fishing cooperative, a lifeline for many families in Havenwood, which Elias had supposedly bankrupted through aggressive market manipulation. The ledger, however, showed substantial, regular payments to a fisherman's resettlement fund, anonymous. While the newspaper screamed about unemployment and despair, Elias had been quietly ensuring that families had enough to survive, to retrain, to find new livelihoods. He had played the villain so thoroughly that no one would ever connect him to the sudden, unexpected resilience of those he had supposedly crushed. There was the entry for the Riverbend Wildlife Sanctuary, land acquisition and maintenance. For years, environmental groups had lauded an anonymous benefactor for preserving vast tracts of pristine land along the river, land that Elias Thorne himself was publicly rumored to be eyeing for a controversial industrial development. The outrage over his supposed plans had served as the perfect distraction, while he secured and protected the very land everyone believed he wanted to exploit. His public greed was a shield for his private generosity. The thought of his isolation twisted Elara's gut. What kind of life had that been? To deliberately court opprobrium, to be the town pariah, all while silently being its greatest benefactor. He must have lived in an agony of unspoken compassion, unable to defend himself, unable to seek comfort or understanding. He chose the path of the solitary martyr, sacrificing his own reputation for the collective good. It was a selflessness so profound it verged on the masochistic. Why? Elara agonized over this. Why this elaborate charade? Why not simply be a public philanthropist? The answer, she began to understand, lay in the very nature of Havenwood itself, and perhaps in Elias Thorne's own deep cynicism. He must have believed that any public good linked to his name, given his cutthroat business practices, would be viewed with suspicion, dismissed as a tax write-off, or perceived as a desperate attempt to whitewash his image. He wanted the good to be pure, untainted by the shadow of Thorne Industries. He understood that sometimes the only way to truly help was to do so unseen, to relinquish all credit and to accept all the blame. And the debts she inherited, they weren't punitive. They were a final, brilliant stroke of his calculated design. Elias Thorne hadn't simply left her a house. He had left her a testament. The vast sums she thought were his liabilities were actually his remaining capital, carefully segmented and waiting to be deployed. By requiring her to personally pay them, he was not only forcing her to confront his true nature, but also ensuring that the funds would continue to be used for the community, or that someone, she, would unearth the truth. He was testing her resolve, her intellect, and ultimately, her capacity for understanding a complex legacy. Would she simply accept the easy narrative, or would she dig deeper? Even when the surface repulsed her, the shame she carried for her grandfather evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of understanding and a deep, aching respect. Elias hadn't burdened her with debt. He had given her a test of whether she would simply accept the surface-level narrative or dig deeper and understand the full, complex legacy she inherited, ultimately revealing her own capacity for compassion and commitment to a community she thought she scorned. He wasn't a villain, but a tragic figure, sacrificing his reputation for the well-being of the very community that reviled him. A powerful sense of purpose surged through Elara. This wasn't just about saving an estate anymore. This was about correcting a profound historical injustice. It was about honoring a man who had chosen a life of silent sacrifice. It was about continuing his work, not just paying off his debts, but transforming them into tangible acts of continued compassion. The path forward was suddenly clear, illuminated by the quiet light of Elias's hidden ledger. The weight on her shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer a crushing burden, but a profound, sacred responsibility. Elara stood in the center of Elias Thorne's study, no longer feeling the crushing weight of impending failure, but profound, almost spiritual liberation. The hidden ledger lay open on the vast mahogany desk, a beacon of truth amidst the lingering shadows. The shame she carried for her grandfather had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of understanding and a deep, aching respect. Elias hadn't burdened her with debt. He had given her a test, a crucible, designed not to break her, but to reveal her own capacity for compassion and commitment. The silence of the manor, once oppressive, now felt reverent. Every creak of the ancient timbers seemed to whisper not of decay, but a quiet, enduring purpose. Elara saw the dust motes dancing in the sunlight no longer as symbols of neglect, but as tiny particles of forgotten stories, now finally able to shine. The air, once heavy with the scent of age and despair, now carried a faint, almost imperceptible current of hope. She thought of the townspeople of Havenwood, their wary eyes and hushed judgments. How wrong they had been. How wrong she had been. Elias Thorne, the ruthless magnate, the heartless businessman, was in fact a selfless protector. He had chosen to be the villain in their collective narrative, a monstrous figure against which their quiet struggles could be played out, while he tirelessly, anonymously orchestrated their survival and well-being. His ruthless land acquisitions had been strategic maneuvers to secure sites for community projects. His hostile takeovers had preserved jobs and provided essential funds for struggling families. Every public act of perceived cruelty had been a meticulously crafted facade, a cloak of darkness under which he performed acts of incredible light. This wasn't mere philanthropy. This was profound, almost monastic sacrifice. Elias Thorne had forfeited public recognition, personal warmth, and the simple human need for appreciation. He had embraced isolation and scorn, accepting the role of the pariah, so that the good he did would not be scrutinized, debated, or politicized. He had truly understood that sometimes the only way to genuinely help was to do so unseen, to relinquish all credit, and to absorb all the blame. What immense strength that must have required. What a lonely existence. Elara's own life, with its focus on self-expression through art, suddenly felt small in comparison to the monumental scale of his selflessness. She had pursued beauty and personal fulfillment, while he had wrestled with the ugliness of the world, quietly shaping it into something better, brick by unseen brick. The moral test she had initially perceived, should I abandon this cursed legacy, now seemed laughably simplistic. The true test was not whether she would walk away, but whether she would truly understand. And in that understanding, would she find the courage to continue what he had started? The answer, clear and resonant, vibrated through her. Yes, not just for Elias, but for herself. Unearthing this truth had profoundly changed her. It had stripped away her cynicism, deepened her empathy, and given her a sense of purpose that transcended her individual artistic pursuits. She realized that her own capacity for compassion, though different in expression, was perhaps a dormant echo of his. He hadn't just left her money and property. He had left her a blueprint for a life of meaningful impact, a challenge to look beyond appearances and to seek the hidden good. Her task wasn't merely to pay off debts. It was to continue his quiet, compassionate legacy. The vast sums she had believed her liabilities were, in fact, the precisely calculated capital needed to sustain his anonymous network of giving. This was his ultimate safeguard, a final, ingenious way to ensure his benevolence continued even after his death, forcing the inheritor to either abandon the wealth, and thus the community it supported, or uncover the elaborate truth. A powerful sense of responsibility settled over her, not as a burden, but as a privilege. She was the unlikely steward of a secret legacy of kindness. The questions that now filled her mind were no longer about how to escape, but how to ensure this work continued, how to manage these funds, maintain the anonymity, and honor the spirit of Elias's sacrifice. The path forward was suddenly clear, illuminated by the quiet light of Elias's hidden ledger. The weight on her shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer a crushing burden, but profound, sacred responsibility. Elara, the independent artist, had found herself unexpectedly bound to a silent mission, forever changed by the true nature of the man she had so wrongly judged. Elara stood before the Havenwood Town Council, the hidden ledger open on the polished oak table before her. The weight of it, no longer a burden of despair but profound responsibility, settled firmly in her hands. The room, usually a theater of strained civility and quiet grievances, was hushed, every eye fixed on her. Mayor Thompson, his face a careful mask of professional skepticism, sat at the head of the table. Mr. Henderson, the hardware store owner, and Mrs. Gable from the bakery were also present, their expressions a mix of curiosity and a familiar, unspoken judgment. She didn't launch into an immediate, dramatic revelation. The truth of Elias Thorne was too delicate, too nuanced, to be flung out like a bombshell. Instead, she began with the practicalities, addressing the elephant in the room that was the imminent liquidation of the Thorne estate. As you know, Elara began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, the 6-month period for managing my grandfather's estate is nearing its end. The debts, as widely understood, are substantial. A ripple of murmurs went through the room, a collective nod of "we told you so." Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, ready to interject with plans for the estate's dismantling. However, she continued, raising her voice slightly, I have spent the past months immersed in Elias Thorne's affairs, not just in the visible public records, but in uncovering the full scope of his legacy. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. What I found paints a very different picture of my grandfather than the one commonly held in Havenwood. She didn't reveal everything, Not yet. The intricate details of Elias's decades-long charade, the depth of his self-sacrifice, the calculated cruelty of his public persona, that was a story for another time. Perhaps for those who were willing to truly listen. For now, she focused on the tangible, the undeniable. Among his extensive and, I admit, often complex financial records, Elara explained, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the room, I discover a highly structured, meticulously managed fund. A fund specifically designated not for his personal gain, but for the ongoing support and betterment of Havenwood. She opened the hidden ledger, carefully turning its worn pages to show them a few specific entries, those pertaining to general community welfare rather than sensitive personal details. She pointed to orphanage roof repair, community clinic project, disaster relief fund. These and countless other contributions were made consistently over many years, always anonymously, always through proxies. A faint stir went through the council members. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her usually placid face. The very debts that have been the subject of so much concern, Elara continued, her voice gaining strength, were in fact capital Elias Thorne kept liquid, not as liabilities, but as assets intended to fuel these very initiatives. He ensured that these funds will remain within the estate, accessible through a specific, albeit challenging, process, which I have now completed. She looked directly at Mayor Thompson. My proposal is this. Instead of the estate being liquidated, its remaining assets, including these substantial funds, should be used to establish the Thorne Havenwood Benevolence Foundation, a foundation dedicated to continuing Elias Thorne's true work, supporting the town quietly, anonymously, just as he had done for decades. Mayor Thompson's initial skepticism was warring with a dawning comprehension. He picked up the ledger, flipping through a few pages, his fingers tracing a familiar yet unfamiliar script. Are you suggesting, he began slowly, that for all these years, while the town perceived him as that he was actually... He trailed off, the implication too vast to articulate. He chose to operate this way, Elara affirmed, meeting his gaze directly. He ensured that the good he did would not be associated with his public persona, believing that would protect the integrity of the contributions themselves. It was a delicate tightrope walk, justifying his methods without fully excusing the pain they had caused, yet allowing the underlying generosity to shine through. The room erupted in a flurry of hushed, excited whispers. The relief, the shock, the dawning understanding, it was palpable. The decades of accumulated resentment, the bitterness towards the Thorne name, were suddenly confronted by an unimaginable counter-narrative. This foundation, Elara concluded, would be managed transparently, with community representation. Its purpose would be to identify and support projects that genuinely benefit Havenwood, continuing the quiet generosity that has always been the true, hidden legacy of Elias Thorne. The town council, initially skeptical, began to see a flicker of hope in her eyes, a reflection of quiet, enduring compassion that had always been hidden beneath the surface of the Thorne name. The possibility of this wealthy estate, once seen as a blight, becoming a permanent source of good for Havenwood, was too profound to dismiss. Elara had not only saved the estate, but had unearthed a hidden history of profound generosity. She had transformed a legacy of scorn into one of quiet, enduring hope. The legal notice, once a death sentence, had become a birth certificate for a new future for Havenwood, one built on a foundation of secret kindness. As the council members, slowly but surely, began to nod in agreement, a warmth spread through Elara. She had faced her test, delved into the shadows, and emerged not just with changed perspective, but with a profound, personal sense of purpose. Her journey into the past had unexpectedly forged her future, intertwined now with quiet, blossoming hope of Havenwood.